Here, some discussion took place upon the comparative merit of the English and French seamen. I urged that English sailors fought with more confidence, that if any accidents happened to the ships in action, they would remedy them much sooner and would fight longer than French seamen. Napoleon said he agreed in everything but the last. Signori dottori, said he, il marinero francese è bravo quanto l'inglese. The French seaman is as brave as the English. The French soldiers had a great contempt for the English troops at the beginning of the war, caused perhaps by the failure of the expedition under the Duke of York, the great one of alertness in the English advance posts, and the misfortunes which befell your armies. In this they were fools, as the English were well known to be a brave nation. It was probably by a similar error that Régnier was beaten by your General Stuart, as the French imagined that you would run away and be driven into the sea. Régnier was a man of talent, but more fit to give counsel to an army of 20 or 30,000 men than to command one of 5 or 6. Your troops on that day were nearly all English, and Régnier's were chiefly Poles. It is difficult to conceive how little the French soldiers thought of yours until they were taught the contrary of your seamen. They always spoke in terms of respect, although they would only allow that they were more expert and quick, but not more brave than their own. When, continued Napoleon, I was at Tilsit with the Emperor Alexander and the King of Russia, I was the most ignorant of the three in military affairs. These two sovereigns, especially the King of Russia, were completely au fait. As to the number of buttons there ought to be in front of a jacket, how many behind, and the manner in which the skirts ought to be cut. Not a tailor in the army knew better than King Frederick how many measures of cloth it took to make a jacket. In fact, continued he, laughing, I was nobody in comparison with them. They continually tormented me with questions about matters belonging to tailors, of which I was entirely ignorant, though in order not to affront them, I answered just as gravely as if the fate of an army depended upon the cut of a jacket. When I went to see the King of Russia instead of a library, I found he had a large room like an arsenal, furnished with shelves and pegs, in which were placed 50 or 60 jackets of various modes. Every day he changed his fashion and put on a different one. He was a tall, dry-looking fellow, and would give a good idea of Don Quixote. He attached more importance to the cut of a dragoon or a hussar uniform than was necessary for the salvation of a kingdom. At Jena, his army performed the finest and most showy maneuvers possible, but I soon put a stop to their coglionery and taught them that to fight and to execute dazzling maneuvers and wear splendid uniforms were very different affairs. If, added he, the French army had been commanded by a tailor, the King of Russia would certainly have gained the day from his superior knowledge in that art. But as victories depend more upon the skill of the general commanding the troops than upon that of the tailor who makes their jackets, he consequently failed. The emperor then observed that we allowed too much baggage and too many women to accompany our armies. Women, when they are bad, said he, are worse than men and are more ready to commit crimes. The soft sex, when degraded, falls lower than the other. Women are always much better or much worse than men. Witness the Tricotus de Paris during the Revolution, when I commanded at the Col de Ten, a most mountainous and difficult country to enter, which the army was obliged to pass over a narrow bridge. I had given directions that no women should be allowed to accompany it, as the service was a most difficult one and required the troops to be continually on the alert. To enforce this order, I placed 2 captains on the bridge with instructions on pain of death not to permit a woman to pass. I went to the bridge myself to see that my orders were complied with, where I found a crowd of women assembled. As soon as they perceived me, they began to revile me, bawling out, "Oh, then, petit caporal, it is you who have given orders not to let us pass." I was then called petit caporal by the army. Some miles further on, I was astonished to see a considerable number of women with the troops. I immediately ordered the 2 captains to be put in arrest and brought before me, intending to have them tried immediately. They protested their innocence and asserted that no women had crossed the bridge. I caused some of those dames to be brought when, to my astonishment, by their own confession, I found that they had thrown the provisions that had been provided for the support of the army out of some of the casks, concealed themselves in them, and passed over unperceived. Napoleon observed that he did not esteem the English cavalry to be by any means equal to the infantry. The men, by some fault, were not able to stop the horses and were liable to be cut to pieces. If, in the act of charging, it became necessary to halt and retreat, that the horses were accustomed to be fed too luxuriously, kept too warm, and from what he had learned, greatly neglected by the riders. I offered some explanations about the quantity of baggage allowed by Lord Wellington, which I said did not exceed a small portmanteau for each officer, that only 5 women to 100 men were allowed to embark for foreign service, and that new regulations had been adopted to prevent the horses of the cavalry from being kept too warm or too highly pampered. Napoleon replied that he had been informed by French officers that the baggage of 1 English officer in France or in Belgium was greater than that of 10 French. The 18th, Major Ferguson came to Longwood, being asked why he did not call upon the Bertrands occasionally. He replied that the governor had signified his desire that no communication beyond that of a common salutation should take place between the officers of the 53rd Regiment and the persons detained on St. Helena. He admitted that the dark and mysterious conduct pursued towards the French was of a nature likely to excite suspicion, but assured them that in the 53rd Regiment there were no assassins to be found. 22nd, Napoleon in his bath and suffering from headache had some conversation about Montchenu, who he said would perfectly agree with the idea which the English had formerly held of the French, viz. That they were a nation of dancing masters, in which opinion they must have been strengthened during the Revolution by seeing arrive amongst them a set of vain triflers who had been expelled from their own country for their arrogance and tyranny. This idea, added Napoleon, was impressed so strongly upon the minds of the English that when I sent Duroc as ambassador to Petersburg, Lord St. Helens, the English envoy there, being curious to see what he was like, took an opportunity of observing him closely on his entrance into that capital, and on being afterwards asked his opinion of him, replied, "Ma foi, au moins il n'a pas l'air danseur." My goodness, he doesn't seem like a dancer, expressing thereby that Duroc was the only Frenchman he had seen who had not the appearance of a dancing master, which I can readily believe is probably until that time he had seen no other Frenchman than imbeciles like Montchenu, with whom England was overrun. Vraiment, c'est trop fort. L'envoyer une telle bête ici. Wow, it's too much to send someone so stupid like that here to a settlement of a rival nation in order to render his own an object of contempt and confirm the English in their old prejudices. Does not Montchenu, said he, answer the idea you formerly entertained of the French nation? After leaving the bath, Napoleon spoke about Russia and said that the European nations would yet find that he had adopted the best possible policy at the time he intended to reestablish the Kingdom of Poland, which would be the only effectual means of stopping the increasing power of Russia. It was putting a barrier, a dike, to that formidable empire, which it was likely would yet overwhelm Europe. I do not think, said he, that I shall live to see it, but you may. You are in the flower of your age and may expect to live 35 years longer. I think that you will see the Russians will either invade and take India or enter Europe with 400,000 Cossacks and other inhabitants of the deserts and 200,000 real Russians. When Paul was so violent against you, he said to me for a plan to invade India. I sent him one with instructions in detail. Here Napoleon showed me on a map the routes and the different points from whence the army was to have proceeded. From a port in the Caspian Sea, he was to have marched on to India. Russia, continued he, must either fall or aggrandize yourself, it is natural to suppose that the latter will take place by invading other countries. Russia has 2 points to gain: an increase of civilization and polish by rubbing against other powers, the acquisition of money, and the rendering friends to herself the inhabitants of the deserts, with whom some years back she was at war, the Cossacks, Kalmucks, and other barbarians who have accompanied the Russians into France and other parts of Europe, having once acquired a taste for the luxuries of the South, will carry back to their deserts the remembrance of places where they had such fine women, fine living, and not only will not themselves be able to endure their own barbarous and sterile regions, but will communicate to their neighbors a desire to conquer these delicious countries. In all human probability, Alexander will be obliged either to take India from you in order to gain riches and provide employment for them and thereby prevent a revolution in Russia, or he will make an eruption in Europe at the head of some 100,000 of those barbarians on horseback and 200,000 infantry carry everything for him. What I say to you is confirmed by the history of all ages, during which it has been invariably observed that whenever those barbarians once got a taste of the south of Europe, they always return to attempt new conquests and ravages, and have finally succeeded in making themselves masters of the country. It is natural to man to desire to better his condition. Those canaille, when they contrast their own deserts with the fine provinces they have left, will always have an itching after the latter, well knowing also that no nation will retaliate or attempt to take their deserts from them. Those canaille, continued he, possess all the requisites for conquest. They are brave, active, patient of fatigue, and bad living, poor and desirous of enriching themselves. I think, however, that all depends upon Poland. If Alexander succeeds in incorporating Poland with Russia, that is to say, in perfectly reconciling the Poles to the Russian government and not merely subduing the country, he has gained the greatest step towards subduing India. My opinion is that he will attempt either the one or the other of the projects I have mentioned, and I think the last to be most probable. I observed that the distance was great and that the Russians had not the money necessary for such a grand undertaking. The distance is nothing, replied the emperor. Supplies can be easily carried upon camels, and the Cossacks will always ensure a sufficiency of them. Money they will find when they arrive there. The hope of conquest would immediately unite armies of Cossacks and Kalmucks without expense. Hold out to them the plunder of some rich cities as a lure, and thousands would flock to their banners. Europe, continued he, and England in particular, ought to have prevented the union of Poland with Russia.